A family vacation that had been eagerly anticipated for months by the Parkers quickly turned into a distressing experience when resort security questioned their right to be there, unaware of the family's background. Brian Parker, an FBI agent, and his wife Lena, a lawyer committed to justice, had come to the luxury resort for a break from their demanding careers and to spend quality time with their two children, Jackson and Emily. The resort seemed perfect, with tranquil waves along the shore and clear blue skies. Brian was relaxed by the pool, enjoying a rare moment of peace. Lena, beside him with a novel she'd been waiting to finish, felt similarly at ease. Meanwhile, Jackson, a mature 12-year-old, and his younger sister, Emily, were laughing and playing in the shallow end of the pool. Their joy brought a rare sense of serenity to Brian as he watched them, grateful for this peaceful moment with his family. But as Brian reached for a cold drink, he noticed a security guard approaching. The man's demeanor was polite but tense as he addressed Brian with a firm tone. "Excuse me, sir. I need to confirm that you're a guest here." Brian calmly replied, "Yes, we're staying here," and mentioned their room number 305. However, the guard, with a suspicious smile that didn't reach his eyes, insisted on verifying it with the front desk. Lena, sensing something was wrong, exchanged a look with Brian. Both understood what was happening, but had hoped such treatment was behind them. When Lena politely inquired about the issue, the guard maintained that it was just policy. Brian tried to reassure her, though he too felt the irritation creeping in, knowing that their family was being singled out. The couple attempted to relax, but the atmosphere was tainted, and soon enough, the guard returned, this time with a colleague. The tone was no longer polite. "We need you and your family to leave the pool area until we verify your information," the guard said firmly. Brian, managing to keep his composure, reminded them they were in room 305 and suggested a simple call to the front desk should suffice. Lena, now visibly frustrated, questioned the necessity of this. "We've answered your questions. Why are we still being asked to leave?" she demanded. The guard avoided her gaze, merely stating they'd had issues with non-guests and that this was standard procedure. Lena, unconvinced, pressed on. "What's really going on here? Are we being singled out because we look different from other guests? Does this policy apply to everyone or just to families like ours?" she challenged. Slightly flustered, the guard maintained his stance, but his tone showed discomfort. "Ma'am, this isn't what you think," he insisted, trying to sound detached. Brian gently placed a hand on Lena's shoulder, quietly asking her to remain calm, understanding her frustration as it mirrored his own. Just then, a younger guard joined in with an assertive tone. "This isn't personal. We've had issues with people sneaking in, so we're just doing our job," he said, arms crossed. That remark was the breaking point for Lena. She stepped closer, her anger evident. "Not personal? Then why are you pushing us like this? You're frightening our children and disrespecting us, all in the name of some procedure," she said firmly, refusing to back down. The tension was palpable as the guards continued their stance, while the Parker family, despite their peaceful intentions for a vacation, found themselves at the center of unwarranted scrutiny. With a voice sharp with indignation, Lena's eyes burned as she challenged the guard. Sensing the tension building, Brian tried once more to keep things under control, speaking firmly yet calmly. "We've answered all your questions. If you need confirmation, call the front desk." "There's no need to escalate this," he said, his voice steady, but his frustration unmistakable. The younger guard smirk turned mocking. "We're just doing our job, ma'am," he shrugged. "If you've got a problem, take it up with our manager." Lena met the guard's gaze unwavering. Used to standing her ground in the courtroom, she wasn't going to let her family be demeaned. This time, however, she wasn't defending a client but standing up as a mother and a wife. Before she could respond further, Brian gently held her back and addressed the guard. "You asked for our room number, and we've given it. We're not leaving. Call the front desk, but I won't let you keep harassing my family," he said firmly, maintaining eye contact. Meanwhile, Jackson and Emily, who had been laughing and playing just moments earlier, were now silent, their faces clouded with worry. Jackson, confused, moved closer to his father. "Dad, what's happening?" he asked. Brian knelt down, putting a comforting hand on his son's shoulder, and tried to offer a reassuring smile. "It's okay, son. Just a little misunderstanding. Go back to playing with Emily. I'll take care of this." But deep down, he knew the situation was on the verge of spiraling if it wasn't defused soon. The original guard appeared increasingly uneasy, glancing around at the growing number of curious onlookers. A few guests had even taken out their phones to record, yet no one stepped forward to intervene. The guard finally relented, muttering, "I'll check with the front desk right away." His tone was strained, his confidence clearly shaken. Brian took a deep breath, holding in his frustration, while Lena, though quiet, kept a sharp eye on the guards, ready for any further trouble. But soon, the situation intensified even more. A group of guards returned, this time accompanied by two stern-faced local police officers who marched straight toward the Parkers. The once relaxed poolside atmosphere turned tense, and guests stopped to watch. Some whispered among themselves, while others continued recording the scene. The officer leading the group addressed Brian directly, his voice firm. "We've had a report of an incident here. I'll need to see your identification." Though Brian was used to high-pressure situations, a wave of anger swelled within him. Standing tall, he looked the officer in the eye and replied clearly, "I've already explained to security that my family and I are guests here in room 305. I'm Brian Parker, an FBI agent, and we haven't done anything wrong." The officer seemed unfazed and interrupted him with a dismissive tone. "Hand over your ID now." Lena immediately stood up, her voice filled with anger. "My husband just told you he's an FBI agent. There's no reason for this harassment, especially in front of our children." The officer, unbothered by her protest, kept his focus on Brian, his hand hovering near his belt where his handcuffs dangled. "ID now, or we'll follow procedure," he said, leaving no room for debate. Calmly but reluctantly, Brian retrieved his wallet, showing his FBI badge and ID. "Here's my ID," he said, his voice composed, though his frustration was evident. The officer examined it briefly, then handed it back with a sneer. "I'm not interested in some badge. Show me real identification, not something you could have picked up at a gift shop." Lena clenched her fists, her breathing growing quicker as she struggled to contain her anger. "What did you just say?" she demanded. But Brian quickly placed a hand on her shoulder, quietly urging her to stay calm. "Easy, Lena," he whispered, though he, too, was filled with simmering fury. The officer's gaze hardened. "This is your last chance. Show valid ID, or we'll proceed as required." Having no choice, Brian reached for his driver's license and handed it over. "Here's my official ID," he said, his tone turning cold. The officer glanced at the license dismissively and tossed it back. "We still haven't gotten confirmation from the front desk, so until we do, I'm asking you and your family to leave the area." Lena had had enough. Stepping forward, she confronted the officer, her voice unyielding. "We're guests here, and we're not going anywhere. If you continue to harass us, I'll make sure there are consequences. This treatment is unlawful, and I'll see to it that this goes public." The officer's eyes narrowed defiantly. "And who exactly do you think you are, threatening us like that?" Unfazed, Lena met his gaze without flinching. "I'm a lawyer, and my husband is a federal agent. You're making a serious mistake treating us this way, and I assure you, I won't let it go unnoticed." A tense silence filled the pool area as whispers grew louder. Several guests were now openly recording, capturing the charge scene as tension thickened around them. Brian glanced at Lena, worry etched on his face. The situation was rapidly escalating, and he knew any wrong move could push it beyond repair. Just then, the younger officer, the one who had been challenging them from the start, stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs as he moved closer to Brian. "Put your hands behind your back or we'll use force," he warned. Remaining calm but resolute, Brian looked straight at the officer. "You're making a serious mistake," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet determination. Memories of past conflicts rushed back to him. Years of service in the FBI, confronting dangerous criminals, staying sharp under pressure. Yet, he had never felt so helpless as he did now. His years of protecting his country and enforcing the law seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of such baseless prejudice. Brian thought back to a significant case from 5 years ago, one he had led investigating police brutality. He had meticulously gathered evidence and interviewed witnesses to expose a horrifying truth. The tragic death of an unarmed black teenager was no accident, but a clear abuse of power. Back then, he had fought relentlessly to secure justice for the victim, never imagining he might one day face similar treatment himself. Looking over at Lena, he felt a pang of sadness. She had always been his unwavering partner, battling for justice and defending the rights of those overlooked by society. But today, she wasn't a lawyer fighting someone else's battle. She was a wife and mother protecting her family, standing against an injustice that felt far too personal. For Brian, that hurt more than anything else. As the officer raised the cuffs, ready to clasp them around Brian's wrists, he couldn't help but recall all the dangerous criminals he'd apprehended over the years. Drug traffickers, domestic terrorists, people who truly pose a threat to society. Now, in a twisted turn of events, he, a man dedicated to his country, was being treated as a criminal, and all because of an unjust suspicion tied to his appearance. A flood of memories washed over him, and he thought back to the first time he and Lena had to explain the concept of racism to their son Jackson. Back then, Jackson had only been 10, yet old enough to notice the subtle, uneasy stares their family often received. "Why do they keep looking at us like that?" he had asked, with a look of innocent confusion in his eyes. Brian had struggled to find the right words, attempting to keep his response as simple as possible while masking the bitterness he felt. He had known that, despite his words, he couldn't shelter Jackson from such harsh realities forever. And now, as he glanced at his son's face, that same look of confusion and fear was there, although Jackson was a few years older. Standing beside him, his younger sister Emily clung tightly to her mother, eyes brimming with tears. Brian's heart twisted painfully. His children didn't deserve to witness this. He didn't want their memories to be scarred with the image of their father handcuffed like a common criminal. He took a deep breath, determined to keep calm, realizing that any resistance or display of frustration could push the situation to an irreversible edge, placing his family at greater risk. Yet, the young officer in front of him saw only defiance in his eyes, misinterpreting it as a challenge and appearing almost eager to see Brian resist. Brian finally spoke in a steady voice, "All right," as he raised his hands behind his back, signaling compliance. There was no defeat in his gaze, only a fierce resolve to remain composed for the sake of his family. As the cuffs locked around his wrists, Emily began to cry quietly, and Jackson looked on frozen, with a blend of hurt and confusion on his face. Brian offered his children a reassuring look, though inside, the anger burned hotter than ever. He knew he had to endure this moment for them, but he also knew that this injustice would not go unanswered. When the metal cuff snapped around his wrists, Lena felt her patience shatter. She had held her composure long enough, but now, seeing her husband, the man she loved, who had protected countless lives, being treated like a criminal, she could no longer stay silent. She strode towards the officer, fury blazing in her eyes, her voice cutting through the tense silence that had fallen around the pool. People who had been quietly watching the scene, some recording it on their phones, turned their full attention to her. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" Lena's voice echoed, fierce and unwavering. "Do you understand that you are handcuffing a federal agent? Do you have any idea of the mistake you're making?" The young officer, cuffs in hand, looked up with a mixture of irritation and defiance. "Ma'am, if you don't back up, we'll be forced to detain you as well," he replied, his tone sharp but losing its confidence. Lena stepped even closer, her stance unyielding. "Detain me? You have no right to arrest me for defending my family," she shot back. "You are treating my husband like a criminal, in front of our children no less, and I refuse to stand by and let this continue." The older officer, who had remained impassive throughout, tried to intervene. "Ma'am, we're just following protocol. Your husband didn't comply with our requests." Lena let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Following protocol? Is harassing a family part of your job description, or handcuffing an innocent man purely because of the color of his skin?" She paused, her voice sharp with conviction. "I'm a lawyer and I know our rights. The moment you touched my husband without just cause, you violated them." The crowd around them murmured with disapproval, their phones raised openly now, capturing every moment. The older officer seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation, glancing at the crowd nervously as the tension mounted. But the younger officer remained steadfast in his stance, seemingly oblivious to the attention the scene was garnering. "We're within our rights to ask for identification," the younger officer insisted, his tone defiant. "He didn't comply immediately, and that's grounds for action." Lena moved closer, locking her gaze onto his, her anger unrestrained. "I told you clearly, my husband is a federal agent, and you chose to ignore it. Do you even understand what you're doing? You've not only violated the law, but humiliated us and traumatized our children." Jackson and Emily, watching nearby, struggled to make sense of what was happening. Lena's eyes softened momentarily as she looked at them, a painful reminder of why she was standing her ground. Her anger wasn't only for Brian. It was for their children, who should never have to witness this, who should never have to fear that their parents might be treated unfairly due to something as senseless as appearance. "You think I'll stay silent while you treat my family this way?" Lena's voice rose in conviction. "You think I'll just stand by and watch as my children are humiliated like this? I will make sure the world knows about this injustice, and you will face consequences for what you've done." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their whispers turning into open discussions about the scene unfolding before them. The young officer seemed to lose some of his confidence, but the older officer was clearly more concerned, glancing around at the growing crowd, noticing the disapproving stares and recording phones. "I suggest you calm down, ma'am, or we'll have to take further action," the younger officer warned, though his voice faltered. Lena remained unwavering, her gaze challenging him directly. "I am completely calm, but if you don't release my husband right now, I promise you this will become your worst nightmare." In that moment, the entire scene froze. The crowd held their breath, watching as the confrontation reached its peak. Sensing the escalation, the older officer signaled to his team. "Enough! Release him," he ordered quietly, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. The younger officer hesitated, clearly frustrated, but finally took out the key and reluctantly unlocked the cuffs. Brian rubbed his wrists as he lowered his hands, his calm exterior concealing a simmering fury beneath. Lena, seeing his restraint, faced the officers with unwavering eyes. "You will be held accountable for every decision you made here," she stated, her voice firm. As the handcuffs fell away from Brian's wrists, relief washed over the family, but the unease lingered, especially for their children, Jackson and Emily, who felt the tension still heavy in the air. Jackson looked up at his father, confusion and disbelief in his eyes. How could this happen to his dad, his role model, a man he admired as a strong and respected federal agent? To see his father treated like a common criminal left Jackson struggling to process his feelings, grappling with the fear that this might happen again. He took a few steps towards Brian, his voice trembling with restrained anger and sadness. "Dad, why did they do that to you? You didn't do anything wrong." His voice wavered, his eyes questioning. Brian knelt beside his son, searching for words that would reassure without causing further pain. "Jackson, sometimes people act out of misunderstanding or prejudice," he said gently, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "But what matters is that we don't let their actions define us. I did nothing wrong, and we will see that those responsible are held to account." Jackson listened, though he found it difficult to fully comprehend, lowering his gaze as he struggled to accept the painful reality of his father's words. Standing nearby, Lena kept a close eye on her husband and son, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Jackson's view of the world had forever changed. Meanwhile, Emily, still clutching her mother tightly, looked up with tearful eyes and whispered, "Mommy, is Daddy okay? Did they hurt him?" Her small voice trembled with fear, her little hands gripping her mother's arm, seeking comfort from a world that suddenly felt unsafe. Kneeling down, Lena enveloped her daughter in a hug, gently stroking her hair. "It's all right, sweetheart," she said soothingly, hiding her own anger. "Daddy's okay, and we're here together. We'll get through this." But Lena could feel Emily's small body shivering in her arms, and she knew the harsh images of the day would linger in her young daughter's mind. Brian, looking over at Emily's tear-streaked face, felt his heart ache. He had always wanted to shield his family from such injustice, yet here they were, forced to confront it. Nothing could be more painful than seeing his own children frightened because of circumstances he couldn't control. Around them, murmurs rose from the onlookers, some still recording on their phones, while others watched in silent shock. Though the immediate threat had subsided, a hollow ache settled over the Parker family as they tried to regain their composure. Lena rose, her voice steady but resolute as she faced the officers still nearby. "What you've done today is unacceptable, and I will not allow you to walk away without consequences. We will pursue justice." Though visibly exhausted, Brian straightened, his eyes meeting those of the young officer who had wrongfully detained him. "This isn't just for us," he said firmly. "It's for everyone who has had to endure this type of discrimination." The older officer, the one who had hesitated, stood silent and downcast, realizing the situation had spiraled beyond control and that repercussions were inevitable. The crowd's piercing gazes, the phone still recording, and Lena's determined words had made him aware of the gravity of the incident. Meanwhile, Jackson and Emily, though young, sensed the injustice and pain their family had just experienced, a memory that would remain with them for a long time. With a heavy heart, Brian understood that he wasn't the only one wounded by this event. Lena's voice cut through his thoughts, filled with unwavering determination. "We won't back down," she whispered, her gaze fierce. "We'll fight this until justice prevails." Brian nodded, sharing the same resolve in his eyes. Lena turned toward the officers and resort staff, her initial fear replaced with a fierce drive to bring the incident to light. She knew they couldn't let it slide, and certainly wouldn't allow this to remain buried. Pulling her phone from her pocket, she dialed a trusted colleague at her law firm. Known for her work in defending the rights of underrepresented communities, Lena had handled cases of discrimination before, though she never imagined her own family would become victims. "Ella, I need you to start gathering everything for this case immediately," Lena said as she began pacing around the pool area. "We were unjustly harassed by the police here without any legal reason, and my husband was handcuffed in front of our children. I want to file charges against both the resort and the police. The older officer, sensing the gravity of her words and the escalating situation, stepped forward, his tone more conciliatory. Ma'am, I understand this has been upsetting. We'll conduct an internal investigation. Let's work together to resolve this peacefully. Lena looked at him, her gaze sharp. You crossed a line today, she replied, her voice unyielding. Your officers have humiliated and traumatized my family. There is no peace after what you've done. I will see this through, in court if necessary. She ended her phone call and turned back to the officer, her expression firm. You can prepare for a very public lawsuit. Everything that happened here has been recorded, and I will ensure justice is served. The officer's expression betrayed a hint of fear as he glanced around at the phones and the disapproving crowd still watching intently. Brian was acutely aware that Lena's threats were not mere bluster. Given the gravity of the situation, this was poised to become a significant legal issue if not managed correctly. The bystanders, their phones still capturing the scene, were more than mere observers. They were the instruments through which this story would spread far and wide. Despite being released from handcuffs, Brian's gaze remained fixed on the young officer responsible for his arrest. He understood all too well that within the system, officers like him often found ways to shield one another, and abuses of power were frequently concealed or overlooked. But this time, Brian was determined to change that. His family had endured enough suffering, and he was resolved to protect them from any further injustices. We're not just fighting for our own rights, Brian asserted to the senior officer, his voice steady yet firm. We're standing up for everyone who has faced discrimination. The older officer struggled to maintain his composure, anxiety evident in his demeanor. I will escalate this matter and request an internal review, he replied, but his assurance sounded hollow to the Parkers. Meanwhile, Lena approached the hotel reception, her next target clear: the resort management. The hotel had directly contacted the police and had a hand in the harassment of her family, and they too would face legal repercussions. We need to speak with the manager immediately, Lena demanded, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. The receptionist, flustered, quickly summoned the manager. Within moments, a middle-aged man appeared, his expression one of concern. He greeted Lena and Brian with a slight bow, but his eyes betrayed his confusion. I'm the resort manager. I've been informed of the incident, and I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding, he began. However, Lena swiftly interrupted him, unwilling to let him continue. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's outright discrimination. You'll be held accountable for calling the police to intimidate us without just cause. What policy at this resort allowed you to treat us like this? The manager fumbled for words, searching for an explanation. Under Lena's piercing gaze and the scrutiny of the crowd, his attempts at justification fell flat. We are truly sorry for this. We will conduct a review to ensure that such incidents do not happen again, he stammered. Lena, unmoved, replied, apologies aren't sufficient. We will file a public lawsuit, and you will face the consequences. I will ensure this incident is addressed, and what happened to my family will not be forgotten. Brian stood resolutely beside Lena, his expression cold as he regarded the manager. They both knew a lengthy legal struggle awaited them. Just then, the hotel entrance swung open, and a group entered, led by a man in a police uniform, his demeanor authoritative and his expression inscrutable. It was Deputy Chief Paulson, a figure familiar from local press events. Brian immediately recognized him, the man wielding more authority than the officers who had mistreated his family. Paulson approached the scene, his gaze sweeping over the young officers and the resort manager, who stood awkwardly nearby. I'm Deputy Chief Paulson. I've been briefed on the situation, and I'd like to hear a clear account of what transpired, he stated, his tone both firm and professional. When his eyes fell on Brian, There was no sign of surprise at recognizing him as an FBI agent. Brian stepped forward confidently, addressing the deputy chief directly. "I'm Brian Parker, an FBI agent. My family was unjustly harassed by your officers, and I was handcuffed in front of my wife and children for no reason other than incorrect assumptions. We are legitimate guests at this resort, and I demand an explanation for the discriminatory actions taken against us." Paulson listened intently, then turned his attention to the older officer who had been present throughout the ordeal, now standing uncomfortably with his junior colleagues. "Is this accurate?" he pressed, his tone leaving no room for evasiveness. The officer hesitated, struggling to maintain his poise. "Deputy Chief, we were simply following procedures because we couldn't immediately verify Mr. Parker's information. We didn't mean to cause harm or disrespect." He attempted to explain, but Paulson cut him off, his displeasure evident. "Procedure is one thing, but treating a legitimate family like this, especially knowing they were guests, is unacceptable." He turned back to Brian and Lena, his tone more serious. "I apologize for what occurred. We will initiate an immediate investigation, and those involved will be held accountable. This is not merely an issue of police conduct. It's about upholding the honor of the entire department." Lena, standing resolutely beside Brian, locked eyes with Paulson. "An apology doesn't erase the humiliation we endured. This isn't the first instance of discrimination we've faced. You say you will investigate, but I need tangible plans and timelines. I won't let this end with empty promises." Paulson nodded, his expression unchanging. "I understand, ma'am. We will collaborate with our Internal Affairs Unit to ensure an open and transparent investigation. I will personally oversee it, and all involved parties will be interviewed. If there are any violations, they will face the consequences." Brian scrutinized Paulson, searching for signs of genuine intent. Having served within the system for years, he had heard countless promises, and now, as a victim, he harbored doubts about its integrity. However, he recognized the necessity of maintaining pressure on the situation. "That's insufficient," Brian asserted firmly. "I want to ensure this incident doesn't get buried, and that the officers who abuse their authority are held accountable. I will escalate this matter beyond the police department to federal authorities." Paulson nodded, briefly acknowledging the seriousness of Brian's stance. "I assure you, everything will be addressed properly and fairly. If you have any evidence or witness statements, I urge you to share them to ensure justice is served." Lena looked at Brian and then back at Paulson. "We have ample evidence. Everything has been recorded by bystanders, and I will not hesitate to utilize it if necessary. Both this resort and your police department will answer to the law." Paulson didn't dispute her. He understood that the Parker family would not be easily intimidated or placated with promises. "I will await your information. In the meantime, I recommend that the officers involved report their actions immediately." He turned to the young officer, his tone icy. "Landon, go inside and document everything that has transpired." The young officer who had cuffed Brian, now devoid of his earlier bravado, cast a quick glance at Brian and Lena before lowering his head and silently complying with the deputy chief's orders. As Paulson directed the officers to withdraw, the tension in the pool area lingered. Brian and Lena remained, the eyes of the crowd still fixed on them. Whispers circulated among the onlookers. Although the filming had ceased, their anger and concern were palpable. They sensed the story was far from over, and the truth would soon emerge. Feeling both relieved and drained, Brian turned to Lena. "We've won the first round," he said quietly, his voice imbued with determination. "Yes, but there's still a long journey ahead," Lena replied, her gaze resolute. Brian knew she spoke the truth. This incident would not conclude with Deputy Chief Paulson's promises or the officer's withdrawal. This was merely the beginning of a prolonged struggle for justice, one that would prevent others from enduring similar hardships. The silent crowd, along with the recording devices, only fueled Brian and Lena's resolve. They turned back to their children. Jackson still appeared confused, but admiration now shone in his eyes for the way his parents confronted the injustice. Emily, still clinging to her mother, had stopped crying, though traces of fear remained. Lena embraced both children tightly, her voice gentle yet firm. "We face this together," she reassured them, stroking Emily's hair. "No one will be permitted to treat us like that again." Brian stood beside them, his gaze tender as he looked at his children, but beneath it lay a quiet determination. He understood that their battle extended beyond their own family. It was for everyone who had experienced similar injustices. It was time to rise up, not only to defend their own rights, but to protect others as well. As they prepared to leave the pool area, the resort manager, having witnessed the entire scene, hurried over, visibly anxious. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker, we sincerely apologize for what occurred. We never intended for this situation, and we will take full responsibility," he stated, concern evident in his voice. "The resort will fully compensate your entire stay, and we will ensure that nothing like this happens again." Lena, unmoved by the apology and compensation offer, responded coldly, "Money cannot erase what we've endured. We don't need a complimentary vacation. We need justice, and we will ensure you are held accountable." The manager lowered his head, recognizing that his words could not quell the righteous anger of the Parker family. As he turned away, Lena exchanged a knowing glance with Brian. They had a clear strategy now, and nothing would deter them. As they walked toward the front desk to leave the resort, Jackson tugged on Brian's shirt, his voice a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Dad, what will we do now? Will everything be all right?" Brian knelt beside his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're going to fight, Jackson. Everything will be okay because we refuse to give up. We're going to make the world fairer, not just for our family, but for everyone." Lena stood beside Brian,